My name is Brian, and if someone had told me a year ago that everything I trusted would unravel because of one phone call on a quiet afternoon, I would have laughed it off, thinking they were exaggerating because that's how secure I used to feel in the life I had built. With the woman I loved and the future we were planning together in a small house just outside of Nashville with a dog we rescued and a garden we both swore we'd keep alive even though neither of us really had a green thumb. Her name was Lauren, and she came into my life at a time when I wasn't looking for anything serious because I had just gotten out of a long relationship that ended quietly with more confusion than anger and more silence than closure. But Lauren had a way of making you feel like maybe all those messy endings were just chapters that led you to the right person. We met through mutual friends at a holiday gathering where she walked in with a tray of homemade brownies and left with my number written on the back of a napkin I later folded and kept in my wallet like some kind of cliche because I already knew there was something different about her. We didn't fall fast, but we did fall hard, and everything with her felt like the kind of stability I'd seen in movies and envied in the lives of friends who talked about partnership like it wasn't something you had to chase or beg for, but something that simply grew with time and care and the right person standing next to you through it all. For 2 years, we shared everything from financial stress to family holidays and the occasional petty arguments about who left the dishes in the sink or why I never learned to fold a fitted sheet properly, and through all of it, we built something that felt real in a world full of temporary. She got along with my family, sent handwritten notes to my mom, and even won over my sister who famously hated everyone I dated, and for the first time in a long time, I let myself believe that maybe I wouldn't have to start over again. Things weren't perfect because real life never is, but they were solid, and I had no reason to question anything until that phone call came on a Tuesday when I had just gotten home from work and was sitting in the kitchen answering emails while Lauren was upstairs on a video call for work, and my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize but picked up anyway because it had a local area code. On the other end was a woman whose voice shook as she said my name like she wasn't sure I'd pick up, and when I said, "Yes, this is Brian," she paused for a moment before saying she needed to tell me something that wasn't easy to hear and probably not her place to share but felt too important to keep quiet any longer, and suddenly I was on my feet without knowing why because my body had already sensed something my mind wasn't ready to understand. She introduced herself as Michelle and explained that she didn't know me personally but had heard my name more times than she could count over the past several months, and that those mentions always came from the same person. Someone I loved deeply and someone she never imagined was already committed to someone else. At first, I didn't understand what she meant and thought maybe it was a scam or a misunderstanding, but the more she spoke, the clearer the picture became, and the harder it was to breathe as she calmly explained that she had been seeing Lauren for nearly 7 months, under the impression that Lauren was single and emotionally available and not living a double life built on careful planning and precise lies that allowed her to juggle 2 relationships without either of us knowing. I didn't say much on the phone, just listened while holding back the kind of rage that feels less like anger and more like something primal trying to claw its way out through your chest. And when the call ended, Michelle offered to send screenshots of their conversations and photos they had taken together. Not because she wanted to hurt me more, but because she thought I deserved to know everything and not just the parts Lauren might try to control or rewrite later if I confronted her. I hung up the phone and sat in silence for nearly an hour, staring at the cabinets in the kitchen like they might offer answers and wondering how someone I had trusted with every part of my life could look me in the eye for so long while hiding something so calculated and cruel beneath the surface of our everyday routines. When Lauren finally came downstairs, I looked at her in a way I never had before. Not with love or confusion or hurt, but with the eerie calm that comes after a tidal wave has pulled everything familiar away and left you standing in a space that used to be home but now felt foreign. I didn't explode or throw accusations at her. I simply asked if she had anything to tell me, and the way she froze mid-step told me everything before her mouth even opened, because guilt lives in the pauses between words more than in the words themselves. She tried to act confused at first, asking what I meant and why I was asking in that tone, but when I told her Michelle had called and that I knew about everything, she stopped pretending and sat down at the dining room table like someone bracing for a crash they knew was coming, but couldn't avoid. Her confession wasn't loud or tearful, it was flat, emotionless, and filled with phrases like, "I didn't plan for it to happen," and "it just got out of control," and "I didn't know how to end it without hurting anyone," which felt hollow coming from someone who had been making choices for months that only benefited her while robbing 2 people of the love and safety they thought they had. She admitted that it started at a work event. That Michelle was someone she met during a weekend conference, and that things had escalated quickly, but that she convinced herself it wasn't serious, and that it wouldn't last, but instead of walking away, she kept feeding both relationships, hoping that if she ignored the consequences long enough, they might never come. The hardest part wasn't the betrayal itself, but the days that followed when I realized that life doesn't pause to let you process heartbreak at your own pace. That work still expects your attention, and people still ask about weekend plans, and neighbors still wave from across the street without knowing you're waking up each morning feeling like the floor beneath you is cracked, and no one else seems to hear the sound. I tried to carry on with routine because structure has always been my way of staying sane when the emotional weight gets too heavy, but even something as simple as making coffee felt strange without Lauren humming in the background or asking if I wanted toast. And every corner of the house whispered reminders of a life I thought was real, a life she helped build only to tear it down without warning. I started sleeping on the couch, not because the bed reminded me of her, but because the emptiness of it did. And I wasn't ready to face that silence head-on, so instead I surrounded myself with noise, TV left on through the night, podcasts I didn't really listen to, background chatter that kept me from thinking too deeply in the quiet hours. Lauren texted me a few times after that first night away, saying she missed me, saying she was sorry, asking if I would ever be able to forgive her. And I didn't respond, not because I wanted to hurt her, but because I didn't have any words that didn't feel either too cruel or too soft for what she had done. One night she came by to return her keys and left a note on the kitchen counter, handwritten and shaky, where she said she didn't expect me to take her back, but wanted me to know that what we had was never fake, and while I believe she meant it, I also know that real love doesn't live in shadows or require collateral damage to feel alive. I read the note once and folded it into a drawer I haven't opened since, because some closure doesn't come with punctuation. It just fades over time like background noise you eventually stop noticing. I told my family what happened a week later during a Sunday dinner where I couldn't pretend anymore, and the look on my sister's face told me she wanted to march to Lauren's place and scream on my behalf, but I asked her not to, because I didn't want vengeance. I wanted peace, and sometimes the only way to get that is to walk away quietly and rebuild without turning around. The thing about being betrayed by someone you trusted is that it doesn't just make you doubt them, it makes you doubt yourself, your instincts, your ability to see people clearly, and I found myself second-guessing everything, even my own emotions, as if grief needed to be justified or explained. I started therapy not because I thought I was broken, but because I didn't want to carry this alone anymore. And in that quiet office with a stranger who didn't know Lauren or Michelle or the life we shared, I found myself finally saying things I hadn't dared admit even to myself. Talking to someone who had no stake in the story gave me the space to stop editing my pain and start acknowledging it without needing to package it into something easier for others to digest. And that in itself felt like a step forward, even if nothing about my situation had technically changed, because sometimes progress isn't about fixing what's broken, but about choosing to stop pretending that nothing ever cracked in the first place. I started to understand how often I had prioritized making things comfortable for other people, even at the cost of my own well-being. And how many times I had convinced myself that being calm and collected was more important than being honest about my hurt. I talked about Lauren, about Michelle, about the small betrayals that paved the road to the big one, and about how trust isn't usually shattered all at once, but eroded piece by piece until one day you wake up and realize you're standing on sand pretending it's stone. Meanwhile, Lauren moved her things out of the house on a weekend. I wasn't there. We arranged it that way intentionally. And when I came home afterward, the space felt even heavier than it did when she was still living in it, because the absence wasn't just physical now, it was visual, emotional, total. Her framed photos were gone, the books she loved to reread had vanished from the shelves, and even the scent of her perfume, which used to linger in the hallway, had disappeared, as if the house itself was trying to cleanse the memory of her presence. I stood in the living room for almost an hour that evening, not crying, not pacing, just breathing in the reality of what was left behind and realizing that heartbreak doesn't always arrive as chaos. Sometimes it shows up as stillness. The kind that settles into your bones and reminds you that moving forward doesn't mean sprinting. It just means not standing still forever. Michelle and I exchanged a few more messages over the following weeks, never bitter, never overly emotional, just two people acknowledging that we had both been collateral damage in a story neither of us agreed to be part of. And that strange bond became a source of quiet comfort. We never tried to build anything out of it because we both knew that healing doesn't always come from new beginnings. It often comes from endings that are faced honestly, even if they don't come with resolution. There was one message where she said she hoped I'd eventually trust again, and that whoever ends up with me someday will be lucky. And while I didn't have the words to respond to that then, I screenshotted it and saved it because sometimes a kind sentence from a stranger can do more for your heart than 1,000 apologies from someone who broke it. I started filling my time with things I used to enjoy before my world revolved around a relationship, like long solo drives with no destination, late-night journaling that no one would ever read, and learning how to cook more than just the 3 meals I used to rotate on a loop. Each of those small acts felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had gone quiet while I was busy loving someone who was already offering parts of herself to someone else. With time, I stopped checking her social media and I stopped wondering what she was doing or who she was doing it with because I realized that every moment I spent trying to decode her life after me was a moment I stole from myself and from the healing I had finally begun to take seriously after spending too long trying to make sense of something that was never going to give me closure in the way I thought it would. I started reconnecting with friends I had slowly drifted from during the time I was wrapped up in that relationship, not because Lauren asked me to distance myself, but because when you invest so deeply into something that feels all-consuming, you sometimes shrink your world without realizing how small it's gotten until it breaks and you're left standing in the middle of it alone. Those friendships came back slowly and some had changed in ways I didn't expect, but what mattered most was realizing that there were still people in my life who had seen me at my worst and were still willing to pull up a chair and sit beside me without asking me to explain everything in perfect detail. One afternoon, I got coffee with an old college friend named Megan who had always been the kind of person who could say one sentence that made you rethink the whole way you'd been framing a situation, and she said something I'll never forget. She told me that being betrayed doesn't make you naive. It makes you human, and expecting loyalty from someone you loved isn't a flaw. It's a sign that your heart was still open in a world that teaches people to keep it closed. That sentence hit me harder than I expected, and I went home that day feeling lighter, not because anything had been fixed, but because I had finally stopped blaming myself for trusting someone who didn't know how to be honest. From there, something shifted. I stopped waking up with a pit in my stomach, and I stopped rereading old texts hoping to find something I missed that would make the outcome make more sense, and I started letting go of the idea that closure would arrive as an apology or some grand realization, and instead began to accept that closure is often something you build quietly with your own hands using whatever scraps you're left holding. I rearranged the furniture in my house, not because I wanted to erase the past, but because I wanted to make the space reflect the person I was becoming now that I was finally no longer living in reaction to someone else's choices. I hung new photos, replaced the throw pillows she had picked out with ones I actually liked, and started hosting small dinners again with friends who brought laughter and conversation into the rooms that had been silent for too long. It wasn't dramatic or cinematic or the kind of moment that gets turned into a montage in a movie, but it was healing. And it was real, and it was mine. I didn't realize how much I had been carrying until I finally set it down because for so long I had normalized the weight of suspicion, the pressure of pretending things were fine, and the constant undercurrent of anxiety that comes when someone you love gives you just enough to keep you hopeful but never enough to feel safe. It's strange how clarity arrives when you're not actively searching for it. Like when I found myself sitting at a park bench watching 2 strangers hold hands and laugh over something small, and I didn't feel bitterness or envy. I felt curiosity. The kind that comes with wondering what it's like to trust again without reservation, without flinching at every delayed text or vague excuse. I wasn't rushing toward that future or trying to replace the love I lost with something immediate because I knew that healing isn't linear and I respected the pace of my own recovery more than I ever had before. Not because I was proud of being alone, but because I had finally learned how to be okay with it. There were still hard days, moments when a familiar scent or song brought back a memory that hit harder than expected. And sometimes those feelings would show up without warning in the middle of a grocery store aisle or while folding laundry, and I learned to let them pass without judgment because feeling the ache didn't mean I hadn't moved on. It just meant I was human and still learning how to live with the scar. One evening, while reorganizing some old boxes in my closet, I came across a birthday card Lauren had written me, tucked between receipts and random things we once thought were worth saving. And I read it one last time before quietly tearing it into small pieces, not out of spite, but because I didn't need it anymore. I wasn't holding on to the version of her that existed in that note because I knew now that love can be real and still not be right, and sometimes the person you trusted most can be the one who teaches you how to rebuild yourself from the ground up. Around that same time, I received a short message from Michelle saying she was doing better, that she had started dating someone new who treated her with the kind of respect and honesty we both once thought we had. And I told her I was happy for her and genuinely meant it. That conversation didn't lead to anything more because some connections are meant to be brief and meaningful without needing to evolve into something larger, and that was enough. I started to feel like myself again in pieces, not all at once and not in some grand transformation, but in the way I handled small disappointments without spiraling, and how I spoke about the past without letting it define my future, and how I could look in the mirror and see someone I actually liked again. The more I leaned into this new chapter of my life, the more I realized that healing doesn't always look like joy or strength or big smiles you post online to convince the world you've moved on, but sometimes it just looks like showing up for yourself when no one else is, watching and making quiet choices that protect your peace even if no one else understands why they matter so much. I stopped needing to defend the decisions I made to walk away from Lauren or the silence I chose to keep between myself and Jesse or anyone else who tried to reinsert themselves into my life with guilt-tinted intentions, because I had finally stopped needing to be the person who keeps things polite at the expense of my own boundaries. I started writing again, not for anyone else, but just for me, filling pages with thoughts I never shared out loud, and in those private words I found a version of myself I hadn't seen in years. The part of me that didn't need to be validated to feel worthy. The part that remembered how to be whole without constantly giving pieces of himself away. One weekend, I joined a group hike just outside of the city, something completely out of my usual routine. And while walking through trails and listening to strangers talk about everything from careers to books to heartbreak, I realized that connection doesn't have to be deep to be meaningful. And sometimes just being around people who expect nothing from you can feel like a reset button you didn't know you needed. There was a woman in that group named Kayla who told stories with her hands and laughed like she wasn't afraid of being heard, and though I didn't ask for her number or make any promises to follow up. Something about that moment reminded me that life still has space for lightness even after darkness has taken so much of the view. I began to understand that trust isn't something you give blindly after betrayal, but also not something you withhold forever out of fear. Real growth happens in the middle, where you take careful steps forward while keeping your heart open just wide enough for the right people to find their way in. I no longer wanted revenge or validation or any final scene where Lauren sees me thriving and regrets everything, because that's not what healing is about. Healing is about knowing you've already won the moment you stop letting pain choose your perspective. The man I became after everything wasn't stronger because he'd survived betrayal, but because he'd refused to let it turn him into someone bitter or closed off. And that version of me didn't need anyone's permission to be proud of how far he had come. And maybe the best part of all was realizing that peace isn't always something you find. It's something you create, slowly, intentionally, and without apology. There was a moment, quiet, uneventful, but unforgettable, when I realized I had finally made peace with all of it, not in some cinematic way where everything came full circle or the people who hurt me magically reappeared to make amends, but in the simple fact that I had stopped reliving it. Stopped explaining it, stopped needing to hold it up to the light to examine every crack. I was no longer defined by what she did or how it ended or what I could have done differently, because I had done everything I could with the information I had at the time, and that was enough. The last photo of us together eventually disappeared from my phone, not because I deleted it in a dramatic gesture, but because it simply got buried under better memories, newer ones I actually wanted to keep. I started saying yes to more things again, new places, unfamiliar conversations, even a few first dates that weren't perfect but reminded me that connection is still possible after heartbreak, and that scars don't make you unworthy, they make you honest. And in that honesty, I found a quiet kind of confidence, one that didn't require validation or comparison or closure from anyone else, because I had already given it to myself in the form of truth, time, and grace. People still ask what happened sometimes, those who only heard bits and pieces or who watched it all unfold from a distance, and I always say the same thing now: I lost someone I thought I'd spend my life with, and it hurt more than I can explain. But I found myself in the wreckage, and that was the most important thing I could have hoped for. I never expected my story to take that turn or to have to start over when I thought I had already found my ending, but what I've learned is that some endings are actually beginnings disguised as loss. And the pain you go through has a way of showing you the kind of strength you'd never choose to develop, but once you have it, you never forget it. So if you're sitting in the middle of your own heartbreak, wondering if the ache will ever fade or if you'll ever laugh without flinching again, let this be your reminder that you will, not all at once, and not without effort, but with time, with self-respect, and with the slow rebuilding of a life that no longer needs anyone else's permission to feel whole.